is my great honor to welcome to the show Cynthia Bourgeault, author, theologian, and Episcopal priest. As those who are watching on YouTube can see, I have quite a few of her books in the background here. I've been reading her for years, so it's a huge honor to have you on the show. So, Cynthia, welcome.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, being that this is a CSWR Harvard Divinity School podcast, want to get straight into some of the more religious backgrounds that you might have. And to that end, you've been an Episcopal priest, you've worked closely with Thomas Keating, so you've had this very strong sort of Christian religious life. But what was your relationship like to Christianity growing up, sort of as a kid and as a teenager? Did you always feel called in this direction, or was it a more distant relationship at that time?
Well, I had a kind of interesting, challenging religious upbringing as a kid. I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, basically back in the 50s, just a little bit outside of Philadelphia and in the heart of the old Quaker country.
Mm,
They used to have silent meetings for worship that still abounded. And I got sent for my earliest elementary school days to a Quaker school where they still had meeting for worship once a week for the elementary school kids. So once a week, those of us between the ages of 5 and 12 would troop into this old meeting house and sit down there on the old brown benches with their creaky floor, creaky cushions and coverings, and the light filtered in through the upper clear story
mm,
window of the building, and it was the first time that I was quite sure of a presence of
mm,
some, just I would say a holy presence. I didn't have an awful lot of language for it. But meanwhile, at the same time, we were not Quakers. My mother was a Christian Scientist, and I was
mm,
absorbing the very, very complex metaphysical premises of Christian Science. And I basically can't get the two of them together. I never could. To know, on the one hand, that this God was the sort of ultimate metaphysical principle in a basically a Gnostic dualistic
mm.
religion proclaiming that all matter was inferior and everything could be dissolved back into eternal mind. While while I'm sitting here simply feeling this presence in the meeting house.
Mhm.
And I think the struggle between those two positions must have hit something in me that was already a kind of early seeker. But I
Mm.
I knew fully by the time I was 17 that my path was somehow going to be deeply involved with these great spiritual questions, and so
Mhm.
it's been all my life. I went to graduate school, and they didn't have departments of religious studies where I was working in college, so I wound up in medieval literature. But
Mm.
from there, I kept working my way and angling my way back to the church, culminating in seeking and actually receiving ordination as an Episcopal priest in the late 1970s.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. So you really captured the that sort of early part of the path. I'm very curious. This I didn't even have on my question sheet, but do you still go back and think on Christian Science at all? Uh,
Um, Not an awful lot. I mean,
yeah.
I would like to think of it, and I hope this isn't uncharitable, but just for me, I think of it as an early childhood trauma that I've really worked out of my system
Mm.
slowly.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the more, they don't use the term Gnostic, but it is one of the more sort of like radically dualist
Yeah.
uh, sort of forms of Christianity you will find. So that it's a really interesting sort of and complex combination of that in Quaker. Um, so, so there are no departments of religious studies. You go into medieval studies. What was it that drew you to the sort of it was sacred drama and music, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So were you sort of doing academic work on that, or, having this sort of religious call, were you thinking in terms of being able to put these things on?
Well, it was straight up academic work to begin with. I got in a graduate program at the English department at the University of Pennsylvania,
Mm,
and I had actually planned originally to be in modern poetry. but I didn't get along terribly well with the faculty they had there,
Mm,
and the medieval had always interested me, and there were some very fascinating people who were working the field there. So I gravitated there, and it just so happened that the professor who eventually became my dissertation advisor was had been called on to edit a new edition, a new manuscript that had just showed up of of the of one of the cycles of the English mystery plays.
oh,
And so I got working on that, and at the time I was already involved in early music in a kind of performance way from associates I had, including my husband at the time. And so I immediately perked up an ear to, well, why don't we just produce them? Why are we just studying
mm,
them? So one thing led to another, and I gravitated to some people in the musicology department that were thinking the same way
mm,
about why are we just exploring and editing these old examples of medieval polyphony? Why not perform them?
mm,
So all this led one thing to the other, and that it was sort of baptized by the fact that when I emerged from Penn with my bright and shiny
mm,
PhD in medieval studies, the only job available to me was in Lubbock, Texas, and I
mm.
wasn't about for family connections and anything else to take off to Lubbock. So basically, I discovered just trying to park the car one day that there was this big, old, gorgeous Episcopal seminary
Mm.
uh, just uh, just right adjacent to the Penn campus, right on the edge of it, still in parking distance. And I walked in one day and just dropped in my tracks at the beauty of the chapel.
Mm.
And I said, medieval music and drama. So
Mm.
I walked into the dean's office just off the street and said, hey, have I got a deal for you? If you allow us to set up very, 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 very exemplary people, a PhD from Penn in medieval studies and a PhD from Penn in musicology, can we set up a workshop in medieval drama? We'll bring you free culture, performance, and study. You just let us use your chapel. Well, they did.
Oh my goodness.
So, so that's how I got my first job. I was actually working in a seminary, and they made it clear they weren't going to pay me, but they also made it clear that that I would be allowed as a sort of comp to take one course per semester in theology.
Oh,
So
okay.
this was like falling into a trough of honey, you know. So it
Yeah.
was a win-win all around, and it was right at the period when women's ordination was really gearing up in the Episcopal Church, and Penn was right at the center, and the whole Philly was at the center of the action. As a matter of fact, the first women ordained in the Episcopal Church to the priesthood were ordained in Philadelphia.
Mm.
So that was the sort of natural stepping stone, and of course the medieval background I'd had put me in a wonderful place to understand the liturgy and the spirituality of the liturgy from a lot more perspective than people coming in just wanting to be, you know, Episcopal priests
Mm.
and wherever they'd come from their immediate parish church. I really had a sense of the sweep and scope and the handing off between beauty as experienced in the art
Mm.
and beauty as experienced in mystical theology.
Yeah.
And I all I knew is I wanted to be on that pole, that polarity, because it was pretty wonderful.
Mm. It's really telling to that you know, working within the academic study of religion, there's so much of the work is just this sort of like study of history, right? The study of the ancient or medieval mystics. It's really telling that one of your first instincts was, wait a second, let's bring this into now in a
Yeah.
certain way, right? Sort of in letting people experience it more vividly, like the aesthetics of it. That's really cool. Just a curiosity question. So, as one of the first female priests, like, or did you get any pushback at this time? Because of I mean, they're breaking this sort of like gender rule that had been around for a while, and obviously that's well behind us now. But as a sort of somebody who broke that path open, what was that like?
I got very little of it personally. The first 11 women who were ordained, the ones in Philly, took the brunt of it.
Mm.
Really did, including one woman who was distributing communion one day, and some guy came up as a recipient and bit her hand. Uh,
Holy smokes. That's
yeah,
awful.
I mean, it was kind of hot and heavy in the places that took it
Yeah.
apart. But so I would say the first 50 women or so probably took it on the chin as like any icebreaker.
Hmm.
But by the time that I got there, and I don't know where I am, I'm pretty sure I'm within the first 100, but I'm pretty sure I'm not within the first 50. Uh, and by the time I got in, uh, it had settled down and things had already happened. The Episcopal Church had sort of reorganized itself between, strains of it that accepted women and it was all fine, and ones that were no way, Jose.
Mm.
And so we saw the beginnings of that Episcopal/Anglican rupture
Mm.
already going on. So I just avoided the places where I wasn't welcome. I never felt it was profitable for my own time to just sort of waste time arguing causes. I'd rather get
Yeah.
with people who are, sort of in the same camp as I was and go on from there.
Yeah. Fair. So speaking of this camp, it's after your ordination. Is that when you start to get into the works of the mystic GI Gurdjieff?
Um, a ways after him. Well,
Oh,
no, actually, not so far after him, because I think that it was 1975 that I got ordained the Episcopal priesthood. 1981 that somebody tossed a copy of P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous into the
hmm.
back of my car, that being the usual gateway book into the Gurdjieff work. At the same time, Jacob Needleman's book on lost Christianity had come out,
Yeah.
which I just devoured, and I realized instantly that these people were speaking around the question that had just tormented me, as I think it does for many people in good faith on the Christian path. How is it that a religion that arguably has at its center the most radically inclusive, generous, universally compassionate bodhisattva of a teacher continues to express itself in ways that tend to be polarizing and rigid and exclusivizing?
Hmm.
Where's the disconnect? And that became a real burning issue to me. And to aside from one of the comments that Needleman had made, who said that you can no more ask Christians to follow Christ than you can ask Christians in their usual state of consciousness to follow Christ, then you can ask stones to pick themselves up, sprout wings, and fly to the ocean.
Hmm.
And he was holding out in this book that there was a missing, the Buddhists would call it a middle way that had to do with practice. And and that was just enough to begin connecting dots for me. So I started searching out groups that would, how do you find a Gurdjieff group? And back in the 1980s, it was virtually impossible. They
Hmm.
hid.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so there's so many different directions to go here, but I just want to pause because he hasn't come up before. I love that you brought up Jacob Needleman.
Mhm.
He was actually one of my professors as an undergrad.
No kidding.
Yeah, yeah. He passed a few years back, but I hadn't thought about.
Yeah.
He sort of set me in this direction. And he was one of the pioneers of writing about Gurdjieff, like both practically and academically. So did you end up sort of moving from Needleman's Lost Christianity book into some of his other writings that engaged Gurdjieff from there, or?
I went and saw him. I knew where he was teaching in San
Mhm.
Francisco, and we met one day,
Mm.
and basically he set up an introductory meeting with Lord Pentland, who was on the East Coast at the time, and basically was managing the New York group and was basically the chief American rep for the work.
Mm.
Meeting never happened because Lord Pentland died just a little before I went. But
Mm.
by that time, he had given me enough clues that I kind of knew where I was going. And he sent me to a bookstore, and I found in a bookmarker in one of the In Search of the Miraculous books, one of the listings of where the foundations, the Gurdjieff foundations were in
Uh,
America, very, very discreet on a little bookmark, no bigger than the usual bookmark. But I took that home as a treasure, and
mm,
finally found my way uh, to New York. The thing that the thing that I most recall about Jerry Needleman, and I basically talked a little bit about this in my paper that I gave at
mm,
the Harvard conference last year, is that when he started, it was the era of this hiddenness,
mm,
and even though the Lost Christianity was a pretty much a straight up expose of core Gurdjieffian ideas about attention. Uh,
mhm,
and it's pretty widely known that the the Father Sylvan was modeled fairly closely off of Lord Pentland.
mm,
That it wasn't until much, much later in his career that the tide had turned, that he actually owned up to the fact that he'd been in the work for a long time.
mm,
What he was doing was basically very much a fad and era of the era, and I think it had to do a lot with the early composition of the New York group. But the idea was always that you worked and you busied yourself with your small hidden work group, becoming a more conscious person. But you
mhm,
never spoke of Gurdjieff. There would never have been a department of Gurdjieff in any
mhm,
academic study. You hid, and you became instead a world-class philosopher or a world-class director of dramas like Andre Ceremon, and
mhm,
but you never let anybody know that you were in the work. So you expressed and you diverted your comprehension of the teachings of Gurdjieff into secular modes of activity, generally hanging out in the art.
mm,
So and and I don't know why this was so. I think the fashion was really kind of introduced by Madame de Salzman in
mm,
her early years of taking over the Paris Foundation just after Gurdjieff's death, and it had already been the subject of contempt and attack by traditionalist scholars, Woodall Perry and others like that,
mm,
who thought that Gurdjieff was a fraud and a pretense and a disgrace to traditionalism. So
mm,
so she was the one who really set the climate in which it remained hidden. And
mm,
it took a long, long time for that to sort of break open and people to begin to say, hey, there's no reason for this teaching to remain hidden. It's got some of the most powerful, both theoretical and
mm,
praxeological pieces that have ever been put together. So why not get it out and actually study it and work with it and teach it and create people who are teaching it more openly?
mm.
But that movement really took began to take shape just at the end of Needleman's life,
Mm.
and it was met and continues to be met with almost 100% resistance in official work circles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but
Yeah.
one of the first questions that comes to mind is with this sort of hiddenness and the ways in which, well, let me rephrase this. When in the 80s, when you're starting to get into the work and you're an Episcopal priest at this time, did you feel a sense of tension
Oh yeah.
between and how did that manifest itself, or how did you experience that tension sort of as a religious leader slash practitioner of the work?
Yeah. Well, most of the opposition actually came from the Gurdjieff quarter,
Mm,
where I was definitely not trusted because the Gurdjieff tradition, along with being hidden, was also very, very uh, insistent on clothing itself within secular vestments.
mm,
And to an extent, this is both strategic and true, because I think that the way you describe it formalistically is that it is an early run up on mindfulness training.
mm,
about, 75 to 100 years before the Dalai Lama sort of brought the whole Mind Life Institute path into existence. But Gurdjieff was already working in how do we grow the quality and quantity of being. So, and he did this within deliberately, intentionally secular language. And some of his earliest people who worked with him to found the tradition and interpret it to the West, such as Ouspensky and A.R. Raj, were
Mm.
very, very secular in their orientation. So the work groups brought a suspicion of everybody, anyone in the cloth. And I exacerbated that by being sort of like a typical clergy person, thinking the whole world runs on ideas and on
Mm.
your precise articulation of the ideas so you get them theoretically correct. The angels dancing on
Mm.
the head of a pin never find their way to reality. So I was perceived as a talking head with a little bit of a loose cannon mystical streak, and they were quite intent that I was not going to be given a lot of rope to hang myself.
Mm.
That was harder.
That sounds hard.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense knowing a bit of history about the work and the sort of Gurdjieff people. But it's also a little surprising, maybe as much to listeners as to me, um, that there was more pushback there than there would have been from, say, like religious leaders or officiants,
Yeah.
yeah, within the group. And which sort of brings me to this next phase, which is the move into sort of contemplation and centering prayer,
Yeah.
right? It's sort of 1990, 91-ish. So I just have to ask the basic question first. What drew you to study Christian contemplative tradition?
Well, let's get back to first and foremost the my Quaker upbringing,
Mm.
and I had that really, really strong, strong sense of presence, that quiet, light-filled, tender presence that I'd first met in the Quaker meeting house when I was 5 and 6 and 7. So uh, I got out to the monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, in 1989, and again, this was a direct spillover from Jerry Needleman's book, Lost Christianity,
Mm.
because in that book he had mentioned uh, a small group of Roman Catholic Trappist monks at St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, about an hour west of Harvard, who were practicing and experimenting with something called the centering prayer.
Mm.
And while he was not himself totally impressed with it, because it seemed to go in the opposite direction from the way the Gurdjieff tradition goes, not towards an intensification of attention, but a relaxing of it.
Mhm.
Uh, Nonetheless, he approved of them for their spirit of experiment and innovation. So I read about that and filed it. And then when things came down the pike, and I realized that uh, I had found Thomas Keating's book Open Mind, Open Heart. He
Mm.
had emerged as the major spokesman for the tradition. So I found my way out to where he was the monastery. He was in residence by then, St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, and and there I was. I took the introductory 10-day immersion retreat in centering prayer, and well, it was like coming home again. Uh,
Mm.
into that quiet surrender, waiting, and he gave me a little bit more mechanism around it than we'd had in Quaker meeting. They just said, just do it.
Mm.
But centering prayer was really a deliberate, simple practice for letting go of the thoughts that keep pulling your attention to the outside and regrouping yourself inner and more downer in your body. Uh, and so I took to that quite well. But what really happened, Matt, that put it all together was that I started going back to that monastery, and by the end of the year, I had met a monk there who was their hermit monk,
Mm.
and he only showed up when plumbing went awry or something like that. Otherwise, he lived up at a little hermitage under the arm of a mountain, and but my plumbing went awry, and he showed up, and I very quickly discovered that he had been a self-taught student of the work
Mm.
for 40 years or more. that one of the people who worked in the Centering Prayer movement was slipping him books. She also belonged to the Gurdjieff Foundation down in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she was slipping him books of Gurdjieff, which he took and just devoured. And he showed me and modeled for me how you put together the path of Christian mystical contemplation
Mm.
and also the path of of Gurdjieffian mindfulness. By that time, I had a lot of the Christian contemplative repertory under my belt anyway. I read Julian of Norwich back in graduate school. I translated The Cloud of Unknowing back in graduate school. This is
Mm.
all of what you get as a medievalist.
Mm.
So I had some basis there. We discovered soon that we'd found some books that were lesser known, but we'd both found our way to them, like Ladislas Morris's The Mystery of Death and a bunch of Teilhard. And then Rafe, the monk, tossed me a copy one Holy Week of Jacob Burma, the starter
Ah.
gateway book on Burma, and I read it, and I swear I felt like Burma was sitting right on my shoulder. A private tutorial with Burma,
Yeah.
uh, and so basically, I think as almost anybody else will say, you don't find the path finds you.
Well put. And again, there's so much to, it's so rich. There's so much to unpack here. But I want to, so you mentioned Rafe, so that's Raphael Robin.
Yep.
And you wrote really movingly and about your relationship to him, and it was in The Eye of the Heart,
Yeah.
right? You may have elsewhere. Um, and so I don't know if you are interested in going into this, but a number of our guests, and it didn't come to mind until I was preparing for this interview, all of whom had been involved in the work in some way, ended up describing a sort of connection to somebody after they passed, a sort of psychic or telepathic connection, like a sort of sustained spiritual connection.
Mm-hmm.
And you write about that in The Eye of the Heart with Rafe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, uh, I mean, I could talk about this for quite some time, but when did you first sort of sense that, wait a second, Rafe has passed physically, but he's somehow like still here. We're still in communication. We have this bond together.
Yeah. Well, of course, we met while he was still in the body.
Hmm.
He was he was in his late 60s at the time, and we kind of took each other on, and he'd made very, very clear to me that his taking me on was really, in some sense, a lineage thing that he saw was on his plate to do, and he did it willingly and fully and gladly. But he knew that his days were numbered, and he didn't know why. It was just more like when you have that kind of degree of mystical attunement that Rafe had, you already see your life as a volume in space more than a duration in time.
Mm.
And he could feel the ultimate season, the closing shape closing in on him. So it was kind of the closest approximation I would make to get people in the ballpark of what it was like with me and Rafe was Rumi and Shamsi Tabriz. You
Mm.
know, Tabriz Shams being the brilliant, rough-hewn sort of John the Baptist-y teacher who had the whole thing together, and Rumi being his over-polished and still wet behind the ears charge.
Mm.
So it had that kind of same combination of deep love and deep lineage commissioning, all on the edge of Rafe's already opening imaginal insight. So he told me in the last time we ever saw each other in human life, you'll see, nothing has been taken away.
Mm.
And it was shortly after his death. He died. We're coming up on the 30th anniversary of it.
Wow.
Moment we're having this interview. The moment he died, I became very aware. It happened rather suddenly in the middle of the night of a massive what I think is a is a heart aneurysm. Uh,
Mm.
and I found out literally the next morning when I trooped down to Mass at the monastery, and they said, sign on the door, "Dear retreatants, Brother Raphael died last night." but the he knew, and I began very, very quickly to feel his presence around me. Uh, not as a vision, not as anything like that, but as a continuation of the same sort of atmosphere, the same sort of energy field that surrounded our encounters when we were still in the flesh. And I was given to know that this was where it had been heading all along, that the work between the worlds was continuing,
Mm.
and that the whole purpose, Rafe had said to me a couple of months before his death, do you suppose this is why we were called together to form a conscious relationship across the bridge of death? So he was, remember, an ardent Gurdjieffian.
Yeah.
And Gurdjieff was the one who has explained this whole thing, the reciprocal exchange along the ray of creation, better than anyone else. But the point is, in a kind of quick pass for people on this production here who aren't deep into Gurdjieff, but Gurdjieff realized that we stand with one foot in two worlds. As human beings, we stand with one foot in the finite, in the embodied. Our body is this little thing,
Mm.
uh, and our self is somehow trapped inside it. And with the other foot, we stand in what's been called, nobody quite knows what name to put on it, but they're settling on a word given to us by Henry Corbin, the
Mm.
Sufi, the Islamic scholar, the imaginal, the realm that is just beyond this one, slightly lighter and more fluid and permeable in composition. We stand with one foot in each.
Mm.
And in Gurdjieff's tabulation, this is, of course, one of the major shock points in the transmission of energy from the heart of the divine down to the stones and rocks of this world and onto the moon. So
Mm.
we occupy a critical alchemical shock point, and the capacity of a conscious human being to give from above and bestow below and vice versa, to alchemize something below and to offer it back up as food for the
Mm.
higher realms, is so profound that people need to do it. So this was basically the scenario that Rafe was using as he moved into this, and he was kind of training me to move my sense of space or self so that it could move like an accordion. And
Mm.
and it wasn't like you just leave the finite self behind. You don't recognize that it's all illusion and mirage, but that you play it. The finite's real and the infinite is real, and you're responsible, as long as you're in a first body at all, to uphold and be the place that the music that plays will be holding your accordion shape. So this is very,
Yeah.
very, very, very real in Gurdjieff, and very,
Yeah.
very different from what you find in most of the both the West and the Asian ideas of religion. So anyway, we played on the accordion while he was still in physical life, and we continue to play on it while he's not in physical life.
Mhm.
And I do wonder what it'll be like when I'm not in physical life too.
Yeah. How does the communication change at that point?
Oh,
So this is so interesting. I mean, we can talk about this forever. So you and Corbin and others who discuss the imaginal, it has its own sort of language to it, right? And it's very sort of imagistic, it's symbolic,
yeah.
in these, the causality of it, the sort of, it's timeless, right? So if we're speaking in words, it's something that one word comes after another, and eventually it's going to have a breakdown. It can't be imaginal in quite the same way. So, with these sort of communications with Rafe across the imaginal divide, is it a sort of sense of presence, right, as you described, or is there some sort of like uh, transmission of energy, thought, emotion? How would you describe that?
I would say it's both.
Hmm.
Uh, One of the things that, again, that I think that Gurdjieff gives us a reasonably sane uh, and usable kind of anatomy and technology of this, so that it just doesn't get all lost in sort of woo-woo spiritualism.
Yeah.
But He suggested that coiled within us, essentially latent and waiting to be built while we're still in first body, built, unveiled, I think you can quibble on the terminology, is a second body,
Hmm.
which moves more lightly and according to the laws of the higher causality. Uh, it still is an energetic body, but an energetic body building, operating at a much greater degree of both vibrancy and freedom, permeability. It follows the laws of synchronous causality, radial causality, not the laws of linear.
Hmm.
So, and it is the selfhood and the body uh, par excellence for navigating life in the world beyond, the imaginal, if you want to call it that.
Hmm.
Uh, Gurdjieff called it the Kesdjan body, and it navigates, and he liked to give these worlds numbers. We're 48 down here, which meant that we're under 48 laws that constrain us and hold us down, like gravity and sequentiality and all those kinds of good things we love. It's freer in World 24,
Hmm.
but also more demanding. So Rafe was trying to teach me how to work with this, and I would say that basically what happens is that the the communion and the energy goes on within the second body exchanges. His
Uh,
second body, which is now his primary body, and mine, which I've been growing, and which he tried to get me started growing. So yeah, there is energy, but it's subtle energy, and in some of Gurdjieff's teaching, and particularly the extraordinary work he was doing with his Paris group during the wartime, uh, he was actually teaching them exercises to begin to become aware of that kesha, that energetic flow, uh, that within that inner body, and begin to exchange already between each other while they were
mm,
still on the planet, being able to use that. Some of that overlaps, of course, into the classic stuff that every good shaman would know.
mm,
And Gurdjieff did study within the schools of Central Abkhazian shamanism. So but it's easily verifiable, and Rafe and I could figure that out, that just like we have
mm.
physical corpuscular red blood flowing through the blood of our first body, Gurdjieff called the blood that flows through your second body Hambledzoen, which is electromagnetic in nature
Uh,
and has higher energy and will and purposefulness. So it can move in either direction. Uh, at least in my case, it doesn't do visions, it doesn't do messages, it does direct energy transmission, baraka, the bringing up of the raising of the vitality of your being.
mm,
It can work in your physical organs through set gestures and postures. So it like everything else in that fluid realm,
mm.
it matches where the tide is.
Oh, that's so beautifully put. And thank you so much for that sort of excursus. I think that's going to help. It helped me, but also is going to help listeners quite a bit. Um, so different directions we can go here, but this talking about imaginal energy, communication, your work discusses the heart quite a bit, and not just the heart as is, but the idea of either opening the eye of the heart or placing the mind in the heart. So just to start that conversation, what does that mean? What is the sort of practical and theoretical impetus behind putting the mind in the heart?
Well, I think the first and strongest one that would hold true no matter what map you're processing on this on is getting the mind out of the head.
Mm,
That and that true both in a sort of descriptive cognitive way, but also in a physical and sensate way. That we spend too much time with our basic core identity and sense of selfhood way too high in our bodies and buzzing around inside your head, chasing its own tail with rumination, projection, fantasy,
mm,
and so uh, it's for Gurdjieff. He added in the whole anatomy that the heart, that the head is certainly one center of our intelligence of the human being, but it has a couple of others, the emotional intelligence and the moving center intelligence, and that they all have to get in balance. So that's his basic model of what he called three-centered awareness: intelligence of head, intelligence of emotional system, and emotions, and intelligence that comes in the kinesthetic or moving properties of the body, in rhythm and gesture and mimicry, uh, all balance things. So that being said, I'm sorry if I'm taking what looks like a long kind of first paragraph to
Not at all. Not at all.
but I would say that beyond that, the traditions and the teachings on the heart, beyond that initial gateway of, we get life doesn't start until you get your mind and your sense of identity out of your head, lower down in your being and more fully balanced and integrated. Beyond that, the traditions split, and the major traditions that I'm aware of and working with out here are, of course, the whole Eastern Orthodox tradition of hesychastic prayer of the heart,
Mm.
uh, and the Sufi tradition of heart, opening the heart, that of which Rumi is a supreme artist and poet and theologian, uh, and uh, and then I will speak very respectfully of the work being done with by my colleague Robert Sardello, who's
Oh,
written a number of
yeah.
wonderful books coming out of essentially an anthroposophic background originally, but really working on them in transpersonally present ways.
Mm.
But in all of these teachings, what I found myself is that there's a danger uh, for immature interpreters of the tradition. And
Mm.
I would count myself as an immature interpreter of any of these traditions because I haven't been fully formed and transmitted in them. But the danger is when you just get a hold of these materials, reading about them or listening to them, there's the tendency to pull the heart out of context of the flow of the whole energy system, the integrated energy system of the whole body. I mean, to look at it in isolation and often to pit it against the head,
Mhm.
but it leaves it ungrounded a little bit, and Sardello is very, very keen to emphasize to people, yes, I mean the actual physical heart. So we don't just do the good old Judeo-Christian metaphor and immediately interpret it as a symbol for the whole person.
Mhm.
No, it has some relationship with the whole person. Uh, and But there's a tendency to think that that it does the whole job by itself. There's actually some delightful teachings in the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox hesychastic tradition that talks about how the Holy Spirit resides in the heart, in the little, I think it's the upper ventricle, upper left ventricle. It's kind of quaint and charming. But once again, there's this tendency to sort of put the heart on too high a pedestal
Mm.
so that it itself can get ungrounded, and particularly since the heart will be the organ that really deals most powerfully with with that whole world of empathy and feeling and compassion, that unless it's grounded, it can get overwhelmed with sentimentality, with pain, with just that you watch people that I love dearly on religious paths with their hearts literally breaking over the state of the politics of the world today. You can't take all this pain
Yeah.
because it can't be held in just the physical heart.
Mm.
It's a muscle, it's a radiating, it's a magnifying instrument, but it needs the support and the intercirculation of what some traditions would call the chakra system.
Mm.
And I really don't like to mix and match systems. Uh, you got to know which ones you're dealing with. But from the Gurdjieffian system, you understand that there are real centers of energy around the hara, the solar plexus, the stomach, the vagus nerve. You know how people talk about these nowadays.
Yeah.
And what is really real is the flow. the continuous inner circulation. There's an excellent paper, old paper by now, by a very, very well-trained woman, by Olga Luchakova, who actually studied the prayer of the heart, not just with, in its traditional theological ways, but with some Russian hermetic masters
Hmm.
that really taught her more about the whole, when we think of the heart, we need at very least to think of the whole chest area and system and the perceptive centers on either side of the heart. So it begins to fill out the anatomy. And
Hmm.
that would be my only caution. And again, where I find Gurdjieff so useful, because he really insists on that. He rarely uses the word heart at all in his teaching, which took me aback the first time I discovered that. But
Hmm.
I realized there's a reason for that.
See. Oh, so that's excellent point. Very well put. So I don't know if this will end up on a sort of like side quest, but how do you what do you see as the sort of balancing practice, right? Because there's a certain allure to these heart practices, right? Because it is so affective and feeling, and there's this shifting of that. But how do you counterbalance that with sort of keeping the mind online, but without the mind sort of taking over?
Hmm. Well, once again, Gurdjieff has been the best counterbalance, provided that you use Thomas Keating to counterbalance Gurdjieff.
Mm. Okay.
And these are the two. The Gurdjieffian system counterbalances the tendency of the heart to get overwrought uh, by really insisting on three-centered awareness and really insisting and providing good training, not only in exercises and practices, but in the movements.
Mm.
The wonderful sacred dances that the Gurdjieffian folks learn to do, that you cannot do a movement, no matter how gifted a ballerina you are or how brilliant a theologian, without all three centers being online, plus something else. Because he's just got them going in too many different directions. And if you just feel a movement is slamming you with the beauty of it, and you pause for a moment to just let your heart well up with emotion, you're going to not only have taken yourself off track, but the whole row that you're in.
Mm.
So you have to learn this sobriety of allowing those three centers to balance you and contain the heart within a form. But when I added that for me, the Gurdjieffian tradition is the best single thing that I found to hedge the tendency otherwise to dissolve into sentimentality and some over the heart. That I had to balance Gurdjieff with Thomas Keating, and for many years, I felt it as a tension until one day I asked myself, well, if your head says it's a tension, why isn't your body and being it feeling it like a tension?
Mm.
And I started to look at that more deeply. And I realized that what you learn in centering prayer uh, is that it isn't really an attentional or meditational practice at all, but it's a way of simply giving yourself. Every time a thought comes up, you let the thought go. A thought in centering prayer is anything that pulls your attention to a focal point. So it turns voluntary attention upside down, because anytime you get hooked on anything, if you're staring at a candle and start thinking about a candle and your attention is there, the candle becomes a thought, you let it go. So you practice over and over in centering prayer this gesture, this kenotic gesture of letting go, letting go. And Thomas Keating used to smile and say, well, for 20 minutes twice a day, you get to take a brief vacation from yourself.
Mm.
But I found through the practice of doing this that that's true, that you give up the strings and these heavy pulls with which you are trying to hold yourself to your own being, trying to stay in life. And I find that counterbalances what I find to be a really dangerous anxiety underlying the Gurdjieff work, which
Mm.
particularly in the days that it was first getting started, was intending to shock people awake by
Mm.
saying, that basically if you don't attain a certain level of three-centered balanced consciousness so that you're awake, by the time your physical life runs out, you're food for the moon, his notorious statement, which means that you just dissolve into your component organic elements and get recycled into the next organic and even inorganic chemical arisings in the world. So a lot of people in the work I found start with this fundamental anxiety about, well, I got to improve myself. I got to, I've got to get it. I've got to become real. I've got to grow my second body. And you can't do anything real in this spiritual practice if you're dominated by anxiety. I would have thought the Christian church would have learned this years ago with trying to scare people into good behavior with threats of heaven and hell. But, fear
Yeah.
is never a motivator or a effector of wholeness. So I woke up one day and just realized, well, what's so bad about being food for the moon? You know,
Mm.
if I was told, well, you've made a butchery of your life and, sorry, it's like from Sinai prayer, I learned, the one freedom that will always remain to you is the freedom to give it away. And, and
Mm.
so what that did is it took out that anxiety of having to reach a minimal baseline of achievement in this body, uh, that I can be sincere out of my own sincerity and love and not sincere out of being terrified of dying if I don't make the mark. And
Mm.
so these things balance me. I don't know whether it's just a whole bunch of crutches, but they allow me to walk the path kind of in curiosity and hopefully on my good days equanimity,
Mhm.
so that it doesn't really matter what happens to me. That the infinite intelligence and coherence and compassion were in charge long before I got on the planet as an independent viewing you know, unit, and at every place along the way, at some point, the last remaining independent viewing unit, even if it's called Jesus Christ, will disappear back into the one, and the divine will be all in all. So
Mm.
I'm enjoying the ride where I am, trying to make the best of it, and not trying to push it beyond where it's already, not pushing the
Mm.
river, as they say nowadays, because the river is actually running fine on its own.
Mm. I hadn't I hadn't heard the pushing the river. Oh, that's good. That's
Mhm.
really good. And that was wonderfully put. So we talked about the Christian contemplative and centering prayer. And we'll circle back to it, but centering prayer with its two times 20 minutes a day. I've been doing TM for 20 plus years, and so there's a comparability there. Um, But part of the thing with TM is, oh, you get to be part of the world. Like you go to work, you do your thing, but then you have these 20-minute breaks from yourself. Uh, One of the things that's interesting, both with Rafe and with yourself, is this adoption of the hermitage, of a hermit lifestyle. It's just you don't meet it as often these days because of the direction, sort of post-capitalist America where we're going. So, how has having this foundation in a sort of hermitage type practice, how has that helped you develop spiritually?
Well, it basically cuts through evasion if you use it honestly, because so much of our life, I believe, all the busy work, all the materialism, all the intellectual projects and the identity projects, uh, are designed to keep us from having to feel head on, full on, that horrible sense of, well, what is this anyway? Is it all just empty? Is it all just, it's almost like being crushed by the force of a being that is just more than you can hold. So we run and we keep ourselves busy and we keep ourselves distracted. And it works fine. But our thinking and talking tends to emerge out of that level of distractibility, and everybody colludes in maintaining it, so nobody quite sees around the edges of it. So Rafe discovered that in the solitude that, it called him up right into what he called his bare self. And and I was just looking at one story, since we're fixing to be celebrating the 30th anniversary of his translation into realms less material than our own. Uh,
Mm.
but he had early on, when he was a monk, a Trappist monk in the monastery in Conyers, Georgia, felt this increasing pull to solitude. And they let him go out and live on the bank of the river and by the side of the monastery, and he still wanted more solitude. So finally, somebody gave him a cabin on a patch of land out in southeastern Colorado, southwestern. He was out there one day, just, he packed up his car and came out. The monks gave him permission. And he was out there in the field, and one day he was just miserable and cold and trying to work with a boulder that wasn't moving. And he finally said, God didn't bring you out here, you brought yourself out here. And he said he felt this sense of a bare self that reached all the ways to the heavens and beyond. And everything in him wanted to run from it, but he said, nope, the absence of God is the presence of God. You've got to just stay here face to face with this. And that's where the opening came for him. Uh, when he was able to live in the skin of his bare self, uh, he later would phrase it, I want to have enough being to be nothing. And so silence provided the occasions for him where he could live face to face on that jagged edge of where being and nothingness meet. And what happens if you do that honestly is you can't be bought and you can't be tricked. And so that brought a powerful honesty to his presence. He didn't have to hide anything because there was nothing to lose. So so I find that's a valuable, that was the most valuable lesson I learned from him. I was, that silence isn't a lifestyle, hermit isn't a lifestyle, contemplative isn't a lifestyle. It's a full-on engagement. It's a way of being real in the life you're in. So I think that was what it was. For me, it keeps me from getting tricked and sort of reeled back in like on a fish reel to putting up with all the definitions and the projects and the worthy activities that go flying by in this life as things that are going to confer a real sense of either me or truth, you know.
Mm.
And once you've gone out there into solitude long enough that you can actually see through that, then you can come back and do the works you have to do in your body and in your psyche and in your in the get up we wear in World 48. You can do it with honesty and integrity without being roped in.
Mm.
And another thing that Rafe taught me that he had to learn himself is that he had thought originally, as most people do, that it's the silence that provides the only set of external conditions in which this realization can happen. He came to realize that the silence was only the kind of kickstart, and that once you had found that place and stabilized yourself in it, so that you were really not being weathercocked by the attractions and aversions of the world, that you could do what you pleased. I mean, silence was luxurious for him, but his being didn't run down so that he'd have to go scurrying back to silence to pump himself up again. You could live in the midst of the chaos and the brokenness and still find that point of orientation that comes from beyond the conditions of this world and probably two or three or further out. So,
Mm.
and I think that's the secret that some of the great saints on all the paths have found, the ones that become contemplative activists, the Dorothy Days, the Mahatma Gandhis, who can walk into the world in all its pain and not be drawn down. So silence provides, I think, the boot camp for
Mm.
training you in that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's where you're going to live for the rest of your days. And I think we have a real unrealistic model, even in how we paint this in our Christian tradition, that most of the great saints, including Saint Anthony, the titular founder of Western, monasticism in the desert, he went back and forth. He had an inner
Mm.
mountain where he went for really deep solitude and prayer, and an outer mountain where he engaged with people, with questions, with spiritual counseling, and he breathed them like a natural rhythm. It wasn't like I wait till I'm depleted and then go tank up. It was like this is the natural kind of Mobius loop that a human being who's consciously living between two worlds lives on.
Mm.
So that's what he did, and a lot of people think I'm living out there pasted against the side of a rock, never seeing anybody, but then I wouldn't be talking to you, would I?
Fair point. Fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that over, especially over the last couple decades at least, a lot of your work has been in founding and then tending to these, let me get the words right, contemplative wisdom schools.
Yeah.
Right, right. Um, so I'm gathering that part of how you're outlining the sort of hermetic practice will tie into how people are trained here. The question I want to ask on this, because as a leader and with students, um, we are watching and have been for over half a century now. First, the number of people who attend church services just plummeting, and now the number of people who identify as Christian plummeting. Doesn't mean spirituality is on the decline. I think we can argue against that. Um, but do you see these sort of wisdom schools? Are the people who are coming to you the sort of people who had been sort of involved in Christianity in some way, felt disaffected, and then were like, wait, there's this other way of being spiritual, of being Christian, of being a mystical or non-dual Christian that is much more satisfying.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I would say that that the way I work the wisdom schools is they're not secular. I
Mhm.
very much am in living dialogue with the Christian mystical tradition.
Mhm.
And you got to come from some ground somewhere, and this is my ground. But it's really taking up the challenge that Jerry Needleman threw me so many years ago. When he says Christianity needs a middle,
Mhm.
that connects the loftiness of its aspiration uh, with the non-existent almost praxis it has. And so I sometimes call my wisdom schools Saint Benedict meets GI Gurdjieff. And what
Mm.
we basically did is we took the old Benedictine model, which has dominated Christian monasticism ever since Saint Benedict was around in the early 6th century, ora et labora, prayer and work. And he set up his day with a rhythmic fluctuation between those two parts. I further subdivided it into alone and together because he fussed a lot about whether monks evolved better alone or in a group. And so that gave us prayer alone, prayer together, work alone, work together. And the wisdom school takes people on an orderly journey through all those quadrants for as long as we do it. So they're learning how to maintain themselves in the classic Christian disciplines where you've got contemplative prayer, Lectio Divina, and the prayer together, you're practicing uh, the various forms of liturgical prayer and common worship, from Taizé right onto the Book of Common Prayer to the Mass. Uh, in work alone, you're really taking a look at the crafts and the intellectual disciplines and the study and all the things that people normally use uh, to assert their identity, to exercise their talents, as we call
Mm.
them. And in work together, it's the common uh, work, and this comes heavily from Gurdjieff and the training and the work of working together on repetitive, mindful, simple tasks needed to feed the body of the whole, but with the addition of a conscious work task that keeps them mindful and on track and
Mm.
calls them back. So people practice this so that they can really get what it does is the soul grows right on the cross tree of this thing, and they become more and more able to to forgive their religion, to see it through different eyes, uh, to uh, to grow into a more genuinely esoteric understanding of Christianity, uh, and essentially to become better Christians.
Yeah. So, very beautiful ideas. And so, just a couple more questions, and then we'll come in for a landing. But one follow up there: are the people who come to you in these schools, are they religious officiants of themselves, or are they bringing this sort of contemplative praxis to their everyday lives? And, as business people, artists, what have you, or therapists, or again, is it religious training?
They're all of the above.
Hmm.
We've got a number of people who are clergy. And I've been very, very surprised and grateful of the degree of support that the Episcopal Church in particular has given at very high levels to this work. Yeah, that I've a couple of times, two or three times at least now, worked with the Episcopal College of Bishops
Oh.
to really kind of work with contemplative practice as it becomes a revitalizer of not just of parish life, but of Christian vitality. So so yeah, there's some that are there. There are a number of people that are therapists. There are, we have some people in business and economics, some artists. But I think what brings them together is that they want to practice on a basically Christian path, inclusive, an inclusive, not my way or the highway, but an inclusive Christian path that takes them deeper into an opportunity to live the teachings of Christ, to live them from the heart and from dead center. And they're people that by and large have gotten over their identification issues. That I don't deal well with people that are angry with Christianity. I don't deal well with people that are stuck on language or inclusive language or things like that have specific bones to pick, as if they thought that if this particular, politically correct agenda was instituted, that their Christianity would be repaired, because it's way deeper than that, you know. So it's people who have had enough maturity in the first place to get to that first step themselves, and many of them come in through centering prayer,
Mm.
where people have learned to cool their jets, basically. If they get frustrated by issues, if they get angry, if they get identified, you've got the practice that begins to allow you to make space and let it be in divine hands. So they're not grabbing it around the neck all the time.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My dissertation, which is becoming a book, is on the reception of the non-commodity library in
Mhm.
America.
Yeah.
And and we're seeing a lot of the same things.
Mhm.
Like there's a desire to return to the Christian fold in some way
Yeah.
after a period of being disaffected,
Mhm.
but one that is transformed. The term is rapprochement, right? Having been disaffected, sort of a more heartful but also reimagined connection to that tradition. And you wrote very, very beautifully about the Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Mary.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering just what role do those sort of ancient texts that hadn't been canonical,
Mhm.
but are nevertheless sources of great beauty and mystical wisdom, what role do they play in your own sort of practical theology or sort of understanding of the Christian tradition now?
Well, to certainly begin by saying, as you know full well, that they're they encompass a wide range of perspectives and sensibilities, to some that are out gospel the gospels, to some that are, what people would in more traditional, usages of the term called Gnostic, dualistic, or uh, but in general, starting with what I think is by common accord the most powerful of the whole collection, the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a wisdom user's manual in and of itself,
Mm.
and it's a magnificent place to do Lectio Divina. I have to. It doesn't take much to persuade people that you just show them that there's about a two-thirds overlap between the material that's actually in the canonical Gospels and the ones that are in the in the Gospel of Thomas, and then to look at this very sharp and wonderful angle he has. I mean, you'd call it, I think, in the language of today, a kind of forerunner of integral Christianity.
Mm.
So it's a powerful wisdom text, and we've gone a long way in our groups towards toward really using it for regular use and creating chants and liturgies and things like that draw significantly on it, reading it along with, at very least, epistles and things like that in public worship. So I think that one is definitely the one to, if you're going to cut one out of the pack and let it go, that's the one to start with. Uh, and then gradually moving into the others, the Mary material is wonderful. I love the Gospel of Mary because it's, when you know how to approach it, it's so clearly also a uh, a a doctrine about the evolution of the soul on the ray of creation through the levels and ascension and what you have to struggle with in the desires and the carnalities and it in order to participate in the sacred alchemy of your being. Uh, but you have to be really, really careful whenever you're using any Magdalenic material,
Mm.
because you're going to have a whole army of pop new age, critics beating down your doorstep with no other agenda than to try and prove that Mary and Magdalene and Jesus were lovers, and it's
Mhm.
been the church's dark, dirty secret. And then second, if you can get them off the track, the next thing are the whole cohort of divine feminine people who are trying to transform her into an archetypal goddess.
Mm.
Uh, and so you so there's just so much kind of woo-woo around that gospel that it's hard to get a good reception. Uh,
Mhm.
we've obviously got a long, long way to go towards getting Christianity reconciled with human sexuality. And and that work will go on hand in hand with some of these gospels, but it becomes really, really important not to just mindlessly recycle old words like Gnostic as if it means the same thing as Docetic, because it
Mm.
doesn't, you know, to really kind of reintroduce people to what it is and to reintroduce them to what actually can take place in when when these gospels are given a willing suspension of disbelief that they could actually teach us something about the integration of human sexuality into divine fecundity and divine compassion in ways we haven't dared uh, take yet.
Mm. It's wonderful to hear you reflect on both of those. I'm so captivated by the fact that Gospel of Thomas is being used for Lectio Divina, and in chants that completely makes my day. But also, I couldn't be more with you about the Dan Brownification of Mary
Yeah.
Magdalene reception. And
We
yeah,
call
and
it brown out.
yeah, brownout. There you go. Well put. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, the very frustrating thing is it's pretty strongly indicated that he never read Gospel of Mary. Like, he references it in ways that show a lack of having read it. Is what I will say. He's more
Yeah.
familiar with things like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and these more conspiracy-driven texts,
Yeah.
and it has had this overwhelming impact on how people have come to understand Mary
Yeah.
Magdalene in her space, which is it's leading to interesting conversations around Christianity and sexuality, but it's coming with a lot of baggage that it didn't need.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you for your reflections there. And so we're coming in on time, so I do just for both for myself, but and for listeners. You wrote the Thomas Keating book, or that published last year. Are you at work on another book now? Can we expect another one sometime soon, or no?
Well, there's some fallout from the Harvard conference and some of the ideas that got going there. I eventually am going to get around to writing a book called Living on the Ray of Creation. If I live that long, I'm already
Mhm.
starting to teach it a little bit, but to really take this beautiful Gurdjieffian model of the ray of creation with each of what he did was to remake the great chain of being, so it just wasn't a redshift entropic model going
Mhm.
from, high might down to a cold, dead equilibrium, but it was a system of mutual bootstrapping that in which energy was passed down and passed back up again to stabilize the whole, you know, manifest and unmanifest worlds. So I love it, and I've watched people take to this and suddenly sort of wake up to what we can do as human beings, and that we aren't as unempowered and stuck out here in a remote corner of nowhere as we thought we were. So I want to write more about that, but whether that'll actually happen or whether I'll just wander off of the hillsides and no one will see me again, I don't know yet. But
Leave it open. Leave it open.
I will say one thing right here and there is that somebody put me on to Substack just this fall, and
Oh,
you might actually want to go up and look as one of the things that I've just done in the most recent one. It's just Cynthia Bourgeault on Substack. Is I've been trying to rethink what esoteric, mesoteric, exoteric mean. I've been thinking about how we approach texts which have been previously classified as secret or
ooh,
initiatic.
yeah.
Uh, and in the roles you're holding down, you might find that interesting. It's begun to accumulate an interesting set of people, many of whom seem to be Gurdjieffians who are looking for a forum to really discuss ideas that never get discussed from within the work. Uh, but
Oh,
I know that'll come out and be the seeds of some sort of book.
wonderful. I had no idea. We'll definitely also plug that into the show notes to sort of drive people there in that direction. But esoteric, exoteric, mesoteric, you are speaking my language. I
Yeah.
could not be more excited.
Go look it up and look at Substack, my most recent Substack post, because I'm working on that in the light of Gurdjieff's three-centered awareness.
Beautiful. All right. Well, Cynthia Bourgeault, thank you so much. This has been such a sort of thrilling and, wise talk. I really thank you for your time and all the energy you brought to the space.
Well, thank you. It's been a delight to sit here on this cold December afternoon and have a wonderful chat with a live heart and mind.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Mhm.
I'm gonna save it.
Mhm.